Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to present really. This paper, I think some of you heard before, it's not new. In fact, it's been published by the South African Journal of International Affairs. It was a paper that fed into the National Development Plan, although it wasn't really used there. So it hopefully provided some insight and so on. The question that we're really trying to think a little bit about is, it's interesting to think about trade and trade policy and how we're dealing with it in the current situation, but how would trade policy help us engage with the changing global environment as it comes towards us in the future? And that's an interesting conceptual process to go through, because it forces us to think and forces us to think about how the global world order trading order is changing in the future. Now, the aim of this particular paper is also to try and initiate some debate on the role of South African trade policy as we try and engage with the future trading environment. Now, this is not an easy task, as you can imagine. If you just look over the last 15 years and try and predict and think if you would have predicted the consequences of the events that happened, well, it's probably unlikely. I mean, what we know, we had the 9/11, we had the enormous financial crisis, and when we first presented this paper, there was a tsunami in Japan. So if we're trying to predict the future, well, we're forced to look into the glass ball, and it's unlikely that we'll be perfectly correct. But I think there are some common trends that we'd like to at least think about. And if you think about the consensus view of where the global trading order is going to go, the first point is, which is clear, is that the emerging economies are going to continue to rise and increase their share of the global demand and global production. So by 2015, 2020, developing countries should account for at least 40% of global GDP. That's a substantial proportion of global production and consumption. The second event, as the future unfolds, is this unwinding of the global imbalances. What we know is the past 10 years have been characterized by huge trade imbalances. These are going to have to be unwound. What that implies is growth patterns in China are going to shift towards more consumption-based growth path. Developed economies which have large trade deficits are going to have to reorientate production and consumption to rebalance those imbalances as well. And this is going to change locations of production and sources of global demand in the future, and we need to be cognizant of that. The third is, although these processes should engage and result in structural change, what we at least expect is the commodity prices will remain robust in this period. China's growth will continue, maybe not as fast, but given the resource intensity of that growth pattern, this will sustain pressures on commodity prices. The fourth point we were considering was the role of trade policy. And what we've seen is this proliferation of regional arrangements, and I think we probably expect this to continue in the future. Multilateral trading system, we'd argue, will sustain and be at the center, where the progress is made in the Doha round. That's obviously contentious, but regional arrangements will continue to play a dominant role. And the final point of particular relevance for South Africa is this growth in Africa. And what we'd expect, given the commodity prices, Africa will continue to rise and grow, particularly given some of the economic reforms and policy reforms that they've initiated as well. Of course, this is uncertain. I mean, we've seen already the instability within Europe. We know within China growth has slowed down, and these obviously induce quite a lot of risks into the global order as well. So if we're thinking about the future environment, and if this is how the consensus view is going to emerge, what are the implications for South African trade policy? I mean, how should South Africa deal or tackle trade policy to engage with this global trading environment, future global trading environment? And what's interesting is, if we look at the South African trade policy, we come out with some key issues. There are two dimensions we should think of trade policy. One is the internal dimension, and this is a particular focus, I think, of the current active or practice and use of trade policy in South Africa. Is how to deal with the domestic industry and how to create the emergence and support domestic industries. This is a strong focus currently in South Africa's industrial policy and trade policy. But the second dimension, which is really the external dimension, which is how South Africa engages with the external world in terms of creating markets and enhancing exports, I think we'd argue has been neglected. And in that particular context, what we would suggest is that South Africa consider 4 goals. Now, these are not unique goals. I think they're quite well accepted. But the 4 goals we proposed in the particular paper in terms of dealing with this external dimension would be to capitalize more strongly on the growth in emerging economies by improving market access for South African exports. So that's the first goal we were promoting and pushing. The second goal that we suggest in the paper is that South Africa needs to reconsider how it can engage in global manufacturing, and particularly integrating in these global supply chains. Now, unfortunately, I missed yesterday's presentation on this particular point, but I can imagine you've had quite a lot of detailed discussion on some of these issues already. The third goal is to enhance mineral exports. It's striking that despite the commodity boom, mineral exports in South Africa stagnated or remained very flat. We missed out on the commodity boom in the last 10 years. This is a key area of comparative advantage. Enhancing these exports is critical. The fourth goal is to take advantage of South Africa's growth and future growth prospects. Now, what's interesting is where the South African trade policy actually positions us to realize these particular goals. And when we interrogate this a little bit further, we open up a number of key questions. And the first one is South Africa positioned to capitalize on the BRICS, or this growth in emerging economies? And what's interesting with respect to its trade policy is how South Africa, its multilateral strategy, is not offensive. It doesn't play offense at Doha, in particular in gaining access in developing economies or emerging economies. If you look at the goal of the Doha Round negotiations for South Africa, it's to enhance market access to developed countries, eliminate industrial countries' subsidies and supports to agriculture, renegotiate rules that perpetuate imbalances in the international trade regime, and ensure appropriate space for developing countries. What's striking in these goals is the lack of an objective in enhancing market access into emerging economies. Effectively, South Africa is aligning itself very strongly with developing economies in gaining access into developed economies. These goals I have no problem with these particular goals. It's really the mission that we wanted to highlight. And I think this introduces some interesting problems for South Africa. The first is South Africa engaged in the Euro go-around as a developed economy. It engaged in substantial tariff reductions. If we actually look in terms of South Africa's tariffs facing South Africa, what is clear is the barriers to South African exports, at least on the tariff front, preliminarily are imposed by other emerging economies. South Africa has preferential access into many developed economies. And so if we look, for example, here, just to give you an example of that, if we look at the average tariffs imposed by Brazil, it's around 12% of South African exports. China, it's between 7 and 15%, depending on whether it's agricultural or non-agricultural products. India, agricultural barriers are very high, up to 40%. Sub-Saharan Africa, quite low because of the SADC trade agreement. EU, on non-agricultural products, virtually nothing. This is the preferential, the free trade agreement we have. Japan, also very low except in agriculture. United States, also very low. So if we look at where the barriers to South African trade are, these are not imposed by emerging economies. Non-tariff barriers are a different issue. we're talking about formal trade barriers here. Further, if South Africa realizes its goals in the Doha round, what is likely to happen is that the preferences that it already has are likely to be eroded, and it will face increased competition from other emerging economies into those markets. Now, maybe South Africa won't gain access into the emerging economies through the Doha round, but if it's complementing the strategy with a trade with preferential trade agreements, well, maybe that's the alternative strategy. Now, what's interesting about the approach South Africa is taking in terms of its preferential trade agreements is that it's not pursuing comprehensive free trade agreements anymore. It's pursuing the so-called strategic or partial trade agreements with other economies. And we would argue that these are fundamentally problematic in terms of opening access into many economies and expanding trade with other emerging economies. The danger of these preferential trade agreements or these partial trade agreements is that they're partial. You're going to get what you give. Okay? They're highly selective. They allow individuals or companies to insulate or protect particular sectors, and you're unable to counterbalance the reform in some sectors with reform in the other particular sectors. But more problematic, if we think about that process, what may happen is you're likely to get high preferences being granted on low protected sectors, or preferences granted on goods that already have been granted duty-free access or high preferences to other countries. So to highlight this, let's just look at if we can just look at the Mercosur case. This is the one example that's gone the furthest in terms of these partial trade agreements. Now, what we can see on the vertical axis here is essentially SACU preference margin on the applied rates. On the 100 on the vertical axis means the good enters into the market duty-free at a zero preference. There's a zero tariff imposed on it. On the horizontal axis, I've just taken Brazil, and we've got the Brazilian tariff rates, and you can see they range from 0 to up to 40% on South African goods in these particular cases. The size of the circles reflect the importance of South Africa's exports to Brazil. Now, ideally, what we would like to see in a negotiated strategy would be very high preference margins on products that are large exports that have high tariff rates. In other words, we'd like to see a lot of the large circles on the top right-hand corner in this diagram. But what is striking in the diagram is high preferences tend to be granted on products that have very low tariff rates and tend to be relatively small exports. So from this perspective of a mechanism of enhancing access, this Mercosur case seems to conform with our concerns that these will not lead to substantial opening up in trade between these particular countries and so on. So we'd argue that South Africa needs to rethink its trade policy strategy in terms of gaining market access or engaging with emerging economies. The second question raises to the second objective is, can South Africa participate in global chains, supply chains and manufacturing? And I think you've dealt with this quite a lot. And clearly, if South Africa wants to deal with manufacturing, it now needs to lock into these global supply chains. Manufacturing production, as you know, has changed substantially. A key component of that is locking into some core or some part of the value chain process. It can use trade policy to achieve this. But one question we'd like to raise in terms of this paper is whether South Africa can actually engage and compete on the basis of labor costs and participate in these manufacturing chains by exploiting a labor cost advantage. I think this is particularly interesting because what we know is as China changes its composition of growth towards a more consumption-led growth path, what's associated with that is rapid increases in the wages within China. What this is doing is opening up new opportunities for firms to locate in different areas to compete on the basis of labor costs. So if you look at South African wages, on average, if we just look at 2010, South Africa couldn't compete at all in terms of labor cost competitiveness with China and with other economies. If we just look at 2000, this is the Economics Intelligence Unit, the average wage in South African manufacturing was $7.1 per hour, whereas in China it was 1.9. Note in 2006, China's wage was 0.9, less than $1 an hour. It shows the rapid increases in wages in China over this particular period. But what we would argue is the average wage, particularly in South Africa, which is extremely unequal, is a bad measure of labor cost competitiveness. With enormous inequality, the average is distorted by the high wages of the very upper income deciles. So actually, if you start looking and taking this into account, and this is old data from the New Growth Path, it's effectively a third of employed workers in South Africa were earning under $1,000 a month. Okay, that's at that point was less than $1 an hour. 25% are unemployed. So what it raises is what we have enormous quantities of work in South Africa that actually work for very low wages. And it raises the question whether that provides an opportunity for South Africa to enter into some labor-based manufacturing, or at least the labor-intensive components of some of these manufacturing value chains and so on. So it may obviously require complementary real depreciation of rands and other complementary policies, but we urge the state to think more carefully about this. One option to think about, and I won't discuss it really now, is the better role of these export processing zones. And I think these have been discussed in the past, but what we would suggest is to reconsider some of these mechanisms to try and enhance labor-intensive manufacturing exports. Can South Africa ride the commodity super cycle? I think we're all well aware of this issue, so I'm going to leave that for another day, so we won't talk about that. A more interesting issue for, I think, this conference is whether South Africa can lead Africa. Now, maybe we shouldn't actually use that term because it's a somewhat offensive term for the rest of Africa, but at least can South Africa participate with the rest of Africa would probably be a more appropriate slogan or question in that case. So clearly we know that Africa is critical for South Africa. I mean, one is the composition of exports to Africa are very manufacturing intensive. They enable South Africa to diversify its export bundle. There are a lot of services associated. So these are very important in terms of diversification of our export bundle. They're very strong growth in a very strong and growing market for South African exports. Secondly, if we think about Africa, and this is the notion of the gateway, South Africa is the gateway into Africa. Well, South Africa can serve as an important hub into the rest of Africa. There's been a lot of discussion on that point as well. I think the third thing is the way in which South Africa can participate with Africa in creating some of these global manufacturing value chains and maybe enabling and facilitating Africa to become a new hub or a new center for some of these value chains as they emerge and so on. And a critical point of that would be deeper and more substantive integration, I think, within the African market. But if we look at South Africa's current trade policy and industrial policy, there's some key tensions that emerge in terms of achieving this particular objective. The first one is South Africa's trade policy and industrial policy is essentially defensive. The focus is about defending South African interests. It's about, if you look at current policies and the application of tariffs in South Africa, it's about job retention. Much of the focus is about purely in terms of South Africa's industrial interest, industrial policy interests. Now, what's interesting is this is not necessarily in the interest of the rest of Africa. So as Africa grows and becomes more competitive, what we'd expect is many African economies become more competitive in some of these very labor-intensive manufacturing sectors. This is going to challenge some of the South African labor-intensive industries, such as clothing and footwear, within South Africa. So this is a tension that may arise in the future. The second issue is if South Africa is going to, and although it's really off the table, but if it's going to pursue the SADC customs union or create customs unions within the region, there's again a tension between the need for a common external tariff and the desire in South Africa to make the tariff structure, the SACU tariff structure, subservient to the industrial needs of the country. So the loss of sovereignty that were required in the customs union is somewhat inconsistent with the approach, or raises attention with the approach of South Africa, where industrial policy leads SACU trade policy. I think this is also relevant for SACU as well. Even the discussions about SACU emerging and enlarging, these tensions are going to emerge as well. The region's interests in South Africa, the region's interests and desires for a particular tariff are not and the setting of those tariffs are not necessarily consistent with the way in which South Africa is engaging in its industrial and trade policy. The final point really deals with the industrial policy interests. What seems to be at the center of South Africa's interests, or an important component of South Africa's interests with the region, is the extension of regional industrial policies. It's not clear, however, that South Africa's perception of what it considers an industrial policy objective for the region is necessarily the same as that for the other countries. What's striking is when we're in Zambia or any other countries, all they want to do is export honey to South Africa. But they can't export honey because they don't make the plastic bottle in Zambia. Okay? I don't know how true this example is, but the central, for many of these economies, this issue is access into the South African market, not regional industrial plans and strategies. And that deals with very important issues about rules of origin, I think, which have been discussed earlier. If South Africa wants to engage with the region and participate with Africa in the region, it will have to consider losing sovereignty over setting of tariffs. It's going to have to reconsider in opening up South African market and reducing some of these non-tariff barriers in terms of gaining access. Otherwise, Africa's interests are not necessarily going to be aligned with South Africa's, and this is going to raise some particular concerns in the future. So finally, I suppose one conclusion, general conclusion that we come through in this particular paper is while much focus on South Africa's current tariff policy has been placed on the domestic dimension, the internal dimension, what we would really suggest is to rethink and consider the external dimension, and particularly consider the tension between the fact that the focus in making tariff policy subservient to South Africa's industrial policy needs may pose a constraint on its realizing its the engagement with its external world, or realizing its external objectives in terms of trade flows. Thank you.